Genesis 14 brought me into a reality check this week. I have been perplexed and even judgmental of that music festival that those young people were holding on the border of Gaza and Israel on October 7th. That's the last day of their Feast of Tabernacles in Israel. It was the last Sabbath, just past Shabbat, the last day of the Feast of the Tabernacles. They were celebrating at a music festival, and hundreds and hundreds of young people were attending that music festival, where many of them were killed and raped, and many of them taken hostage by Hamas. And I've scratched my head, and even having been there in December, scratched my head saying, what were they thinking? Why would they have a music festival so close to their enemy? And then Genesis 14 presented itself by the Holy Spirit to me. And that's where Lot, Abraham's nephew, is living in Sodom. And Sodom and Gomorrah, their lifestyles were just horrendous. And they were, because of their lifestyles, much like a music festival being centered upon enjoyment and pleasure, and people, the people who are defensive of the music festival would say of relaxation, but it's all the party spirit. And so was Sodom and Gomorrah, very much a party, licentious kind of spirit about it. And then it says in verse 12, they carried off. Now these four enemy kings saw Sodom and Gomorrah as a target. And they, much like Hamas did with the music festival and the kibbutzim on the border, like Berea, the one that I mentioned, and Sderot, where they took captive even the police station. And the police commander made the decision to blow up the police station just so the Hamas wouldn't escape. Even though he had his own personnel on the line, he made the very difficult decision to have the police station blown up rather than let the Hamas terrorists go free. It said in verse 12 of Genesis 14, they carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions because he was living in Sodom. Now, verse 14 of Genesis 14 said, when Abram heard his relative was taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit of the captives, of those terrorists who took them captives, of the enemies of God, as far as Dan. Now, there's an interesting play on a couple of different concepts here, and I want us to look at them. One is Dan, where Dan was located, used to be, of all places, pretty well where Gaza is today. But they were growing and they felt like they needed more area, so they took over a very northern area of modern day Israel. And Dan was close to the northern border of actually where Lebanon and Syria and Israel all meet, in that tri-country area, modern day Dan. That's where Abram took, and you can visit that place. It's a national park, beautiful national park today, where Abram took Lot back. Now, the 318 course, at this point, Isaac, Ishmael, none of them were born yet. That's kind of part of the discussion I want us to look at as I conclude here of this study of Genesis 14 and 15. But it said that he took 318 trained men born in his household. These would have been of his servants. But 318, and I'm not a big numbers worshiper, but 318 is numerically the equivalent of the name of Eleazar, which Eleazar is actually mentioned between Abraham's discussion with God. Will Eleazar inherit all of this? And I think there's a dual meaning in that discussion. We'll look at that in a second. But the numeric equivalent of Eleazar, meaning Eleazar as a name, means God is my help. So the magic of 318 is the only symbolism, the only magic in 318 is a symbolism found in the meaning of the name of Eleazar, which is God is my help. Trained Hanukkah, the idea in the Hebrew means they were instructed, they were trained well by Abram via his head servants. Abram believed in a well-trained, highly organized organization. He was a shepherd, which was the lowliest part of society, but he believed that even if you're the lowliest part of society, you do what God's given you and blessed you with, you do it well. And so Abram trained them well. They were trained, they were part of his household, which means his covering, his dwelling. In a few minutes as well, in Genesis 15, verse 1, God calls himself Abram's shield. In this case, these 318, God is my help, means that God is my help was Abram's cover. And so Abram took off after Lot, not casting judgment that he lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, but the fact that he was at one time part of Abram's cover. And remember, Abraham and Lot separated, Abram giving Lot the choice, and Lot chose Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram's not judgmental of that, but he was going to rescue family. Much like the war between Israel and Hamas right now, Israel is in Gaza because they're holding their family hostage and because the terrorists of Hamas, the enemies of God, are a threat to the family of Israel. There's so many parallels between Genesis 14 and 15. Abram rescuing Lot. Israel at war in Gaza with Hamas. It says in verse 16, he recovered all the goods, all of Lot's possessions, and brought them all back, along with all the women and all the other people. Wayasab, they returned or brought back everything. Nothing was lost. The only reason there is loss when your possessions are carried off is when you get out from under the shield of God is my help. That's true in Genesis 14 and 15, as it's true in Israel today, as it's true in your and my life. This is a principle of God. When God is my help, everything is under God's covering. Word got back to the kings, and they came out to meet him in verse 17. And in verse 18, a spectacular things happen. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, he was referred to as the high priest, the head priest, the greatest priestly function of all. Melchizedek brought out bread and wine in verse 18 of Genesis 14. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, he said, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. There's such a spiritual significance in Melchizedek meeting Abram because he did it right. He did it as God is his shield, because God is my help. I cannot do this on my own. Pride. We get filled with ourselves and we come out from under God's covering. When pride creeps in, we quench the Holy Spirit. When pride stays in, we grieve the Holy Spirit. And when we grieve the Holy Spirit, we lose God's cover, his shield and protection. But Abraham never lost God's cover. Melchizedek came out to greet him, to minister food, sustenance to him. And then it says at the end of verse 18, then Abram gave him a tenth of everything that he owned. There comes the tithe. See, the tithe, or the first 10% of everything belonging to God, is evidence that God is our shield, evidence that God is our help, evidence that we feel like everything belongs to God. That's why the first 10% of our first fruits belong to God's work. Wherever God's doing it, however God's doing it, the first tenth belong to God. And Abraham believed that, and it helps sustain. The bread and the wine idea is the sustaining power of God in our lives is when we prove, but beyond the shadow of any doubt, and here's how we do it, with our increase. We present to God the first 10% of our increase. We begin to God from time to time the 10% of everything to renew again that God is my help. He's my shield. And in chapter 15, verse 1, do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your very great reward. God speaks to Abraham so plainly. It said he spoke to him in a vision. This is when Abraham is in the presence of God. He must have been in prayer and worship in the presence of God. God said, do not be afraid of the world. Only fear me, the living God. I am your cover. I am your great reward. It's such a powerful relationship we have with Jehovah, with the living God. Abraham had it. You and I can have it if we are under God's cover. Everything belongs to him, and we prove it with the first 10%. He becomes our cover because we can never outgive God ever in our lives. But we're reminded of it every day because this world out here tries to make us believe that all my resources belong to me, and they don't. And then is the great discussion in Genesis 15, 2 through 5, verses 2 through 5, where Abraham says, what does it really matter of my reward because I have no descendant? Eleazar, God is my help, gets it all. And God, always caring, always concerned, reminds Abraham, no, the promise made to you, Abraham, is that you'll have descendants that will number more than the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. God is my help will not end there. God is my help. God is my shield, my cover will extend to all your descendants, which are the Jewish people. As Gentiles, you and I were engrafted in the branch through Jesus Christ, who was Jewish. You and I are engrafted into this discussion because we're engrafted because Jesus said we could be so. But it goes on to verse 6, and this is my conclusion is this, that Abraham believed, one of him is the idea that he trusted God. Abraham believed Yahweh. He trusted the existing one, Yahweh meaning the pre-existent, the existing, the eternally existing one. And it was credited, valued, considered, esteemed. It was credited to him as righteousness. And we see James repeating that. For Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That idea of righteousness, that tzedakah, is the idea of truthfulness and justice and objectiveness and honesty in all things. Honesty flowed out of Abraham because he fully trusted God in every way. And it was a constant circular motion. Abraham trusted the pre-existent eternal God, and God valued that with truthfulness and honesty and justice in his life. You see that same circular motion, that momentum, that positive vortex doesn't go down. The vortex doesn't go down. The vortex goes up and widens itself and multiplies itself eternally. Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Such a powerful concept. Lord, may we apply it to our lives in a powerful way. Thank you.